My name is Tegan Breyer. I'm 30 years old. At my sister's housewarming, her fiancé looked my parents up and down in front of about 40 people and said, loud enough that the woman standing beside me actually stepped back, "Your parents must have gotten turned around on their way to the community potluck." He said it smiling. He said it like it was a joke everyone was already in on. My sister Kira laughed, put her hand on our mother's arm and said, "Mum, don't be sensitive, you know how he is." My mother smiled and said, "Of course, sweetheart." My father set down his ginger ale very carefully on the counter and looked at his shoes. He was wearing the good ones, the brown leather Oxfords he saves for weddings and funerals, freshly polished. He'd called me that morning and asked whether they looked all right. I didn't say anything in that moment. I didn't storm out, didn't make a scene, didn't do a single thing you'd expect someone to do when they're burning from the inside. I waited. I let Paxton Greaves finish his tour and toast his perfect future. And then I asked one calm question about his credentials. By the time that party emptied out, not one person in that room was looking at my parents like they didn't belong. But to understand what I said that night, you first have to understand who my parents are. My father, Gerald, spent 37 years as a pipe fitter with the same union local in Hamilton. He worked industrial sites, hospitals, water treatment plants. He'd come home in January with his hands cracked open from the cold and sit at the kitchen table and eat whatever my mother had made without once saying he was exhausted, even though he always was. He never talked about the work as something beneath him or above him. It was just what he did. The same way you breathe. There was a foreman on his crew who had a minor stroke one winter and couldn't drive for 3 months. My father covered his route to the site, picked him up at 6:15 every morning, drove him home every evening. He did it for 12 weeks without once mentioning to my mother how far out of his way it was. She found out from a neighbor. When she asked him about it, he said, "The man's got a family. What was I supposed to do?" He meant it genuinely. He had no other answer for it. My mother, Norma, has worked in the cafeteria of an elementary school for 22 years. She feeds 400 children their lunch 5 days a week from September to June. She knows which kids are allergic to what, which ones come without a snack because money is tight that month, and she's been quietly adding a little extra to those trays for 2 decades without making a thing of it. She told me once that you can tell a lot about a family's month by whether a kid looks at their lunch or looks away from it. She bakes. That's the thing most people learn about her before they learn anything else. She bakes for every occasion she can find an excuse for, and mostly she bakes butter tarts, the kind with the runny centers and the slightly burnt pastry edges, from a recipe that came from her own mother, and before that from nobody quite remembers where. She has a cookie tin she's carried those tarts in for as long as I can remember. It's rectangular, has a faded winter scene on the lid, Father Christmas on a sleigh in a snowfield, and there's a dent in the lower right corner from the time it got knocked off a counter sometime in the late 90s. She has never replaced it. It shows up at every funeral reception, every new baby, every neighbor's difficult week. When my mother wants to say "I love you" and can't find the words for it, she fills that tin and she drives it over. I have never once seen her arrive somewhere empty-handed. They didn't have much. But you would never know it from being around them. When money got thin, my mother stretched a whole chicken across 3 dinners and called each one something different. When the car needed work, my father couldn't afford to outsource. He did it himself in the driveway under a work light at 10 at night. I grew up in a house where people worked hard and did not perform their difficulties for sympathy, not because they were proud in a brittle way, but because they simply didn't see the point. I do something quite different for a living. I'm a compliance specialist at a regional credit union, which means I spend my days reviewing documentation, verifying credentials, and checking registration databases to make sure the people we bring on in any advisory capacity are properly licensed and in good standing with CIRO, the Canadian Investment Regulatory Organization. It is not glamorous work. It is very detail-oriented work. After 8 years in the role, I've become fluent in the particular way that paperwork lies. Not always through what it says, but through what it quietly leaves out. A registration record with a gap. A termination code that doesn't match the story being told. A credential that looks fine at the surface but doesn't hold up when you pull the underlying file. I'm married too. My husband Marco is a high school physics teacher in Kitchener, a careful and even-tempered man who approaches every problem the way he approaches a lesson plan. Methodically, without ego, willing to be wrong. We've been together 7 years. He grew up a bit more comfortable than I did, and in the early years he sometimes said the wrong thing about money without knowing it was the wrong thing. He learned. Now he's the first person I call when I've seen something I can't unsee. My sister Kira is 5 years younger than me. She's 25. Growing up, she wasn't embarrassed by where we came from exactly, but she was always looking past it. She noticed which friends had newer clothes every September. She noticed when ours was the only car on the street that announced itself when it started. She loved our parents the way you love a starting point. A thing you intend to build from, not a thing you plan to carry with you. She met Paxton at a mutual friend's birthday about 2 years ago and called me the next morning already lit up about him. He was charming, she said. Confident, he worked in wealth management at a firm downtown, had his own clients, talked about Bay Street like he had a reserved table there. I met him for the first time at a restaurant Kira had chosen because she thought it was the kind of place Paxton would approve of. He was easy to like. I'll say that honestly, because it matters. Good-looking in a careful, maintained way, always pressed, always reaching for the bill before anyone else could. He introduced himself as a senior investment advisor at Vantage Capital Group and said it the way some men say their own last name, like the title had weight, and sharing it was a courtesy he was extending. But I noticed things. It's the job. After a while, you simply can't turn it off. He talked about his work the way someone talks about a place they've visited rather than a place they live. When I asked him specific questions about his practice, client categories, registration class, what his book looked like, he answered with the future instead of the present. He'd tell me where he was headed rather than where he was. I filed it away the way you file things. When you don't want to be the person who poisons a well before you're certain there's actually something in it. The second time I saw him was Sunday dinner at my parents' house. He was polite in the way that costs nothing and proves less. He called the neighborhood charming. He called the house cozy. He said it had character, the way some people say character when they mean problem. He asked my father what he used to do, though my father was sitting right there, still very much a man who did things every day. When my father said pipe-a-fitter, 37 years, Paxton said, "Wow, real work," in a tone that managed to be a compliment and a dismissal at the exact same time. My father nodded and passed the potatoes. He's good at letting things land without catching them. They got engaged in March. Kira called me at 8 in the morning, already in tears with happiness, and told me the proposal 3 times in a row. I said everything I was supposed to say and I meant most of it. By spring, they were closing on a house. She called breathless to say she'd been approved for the mortgage on her own income as a dental office coordinator. Paxton said to keep it in my name for now, she mentioned, simpler before the wedding. He'd be added to the title after. Better for taxes. I remember exactly where I was standing when she said that, in the parking lot of the credit union, keys in my hand, going very still. Simpler. I turned the word over and set it down and didn't pick it up again until I should have, weeks later. A few weeks before the housewarming, my mother pulled me into their kitchen and showed me an envelope. $22,000, she said in a low voice, from their TFSA, the rainy day account she and my father had been quietly feeding for years, dollar by dollar, overtime shift by overtime shift. For Kira, she whispered, for the down payment top-up. Don't make her feel like she owes us anything. My father stood in the doorway while she showed me and said, "She's our girl, you do what you can for your girls." That was the entire conversation. $22,000 going toward a house I hadn't been inside yet, for a man I'd met twice, and still couldn't read clearly. 3 weeks before the party, his name appeared on my screen at work. Not in anything I was searching for, in a batch of registration records I was cross-referencing for a routine compliance review. Paxton Greaves. I looked at it for a moment. Then I opened the CIRO Advisor Report database the same way I open it 20 times a day, and I searched his name. His registration at Vantage Capital had been terminated in November, 7 months before the housewarming. The termination code was one I recognized immediately, not voluntary resignation, not firm closure, a compliance-related termination. I sat with that for a long time. Then I called a contact who moves in the same circles and asked carefully, and she answered without hesitation. Vantage had cleared out a number of advisors last fall. Paxton's had been specific, something around client documentation irregularities. Nothing had gone formally to the regulator, but the street knew, the kind of knowing that moves in quiet voices at industry events and never makes the papers. He had held no active registration at any firm since November, 7 months. And my sister believed he was still at Vantage. She'd been telling me all spring about the accounts he was managing, the clients he was bringing on, the performance bonus he was expecting. She had no idea she was describing a man who was putting on a suit every morning, leaving the house, and driving somewhere to fill 8 hours while she chose paint colors. I thought of a Saturday in April when I'd run into him at a coffee shop near downtown Kitchener at 10 in the morning on a workday. He'd been in a full suit with a legal pad and a laptop. Working remote today, he'd told me. Between client meetings. I had thought nothing of it. I understood now exactly what I'd been looking at. I told Marco that evening over a dinner neither of us ate much of. "Don't go," he said in his clean one-answer way. "You have no obligation to be there. Send a gift. Stay out of it," like she asked. I looked at him. Kira has $22,000 of Mum and Dad's retirement money tied up in a house that's registered solely in her name with a man who hasn't had an income since November. She's going to find out one way or another. The only question is whether anyone is standing beside her when she does. Marco was quiet for a moment. Then, "What are you going to do?" I said I didn't know yet. I was going to give Paxton one chance first. A private one. If he used it, I'd help them both find a way through quietly without it becoming this. If he didn't, I would stop carrying the truth on his behalf. I didn't sleep well that week. The house sat at the end of a new subdivision in Waterdown. Beige siding, young trees still staked to the ground like they hadn't decided whether to stay. Inside, it was all gleaming and staged. A kitchen island of quartz, big enough to seat 6. Catered trays, under silver lids. A hired bartender at a rolling cart. Paxton at the center of all of it, giving the tour, describing the finishes the way you describe something you built yourself. He greeted me with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He had no idea what I'd brought in with me, and it wasn't wrapped. My mother came through the door a few steps behind Marco and me, holding her tin with both hands the way she always does, careful and a little proud. She found Paxton near the island and offered it to him with a warm smile. "I made butter tarts," she said. "I know it's your first home together. I wanted to bring you something." Paxton looked at the tin. The dent. The faded Father Christmas. The lid that didn't sit quite flush anymore. Something moved across his face, quick and cold, and he said, "We'll just tuck this in the back here," and slid it to the far end of the counter behind a row of wine bottles where nobody would see it. My mother's smile did something small and terrible. It held for a second and then it thinned, and then she folded her hands and pretended she hadn't noticed a thing. My father noticed. He always does. He never says, not at first. The party went on. Paxton held court. He told a couple near the patio that Vantage had had a strong quarter, that the interest rate environment was finally working in their favor, that he had a client, move in progress he couldn't discuss, but was very pleased about. Every time he said the firm's name in the present tense, something tightened in my chest. He was describing a desk he'd been cleared out of in November, and he was completely fluent in it. That was the part that frightened me most. The lie didn't seem to cost him a single thing to tell. And then he came back through the kitchen and found my parents at the edge of the island, my father with a small catered plate he wasn't eating, my mother with nowhere particular to put her hands. Paxton stopped, looked them over, my mother's good cardigan, my father's polished Oxfords, and said it easily, conversationally, loud enough for the cluster of guests nearby. "Gerald, Norma, I appreciate you making the drive, but honestly, next time feel free to stay home. Tonight's a bit out of your wheelhouse." A woman behind me went completely still. My sister laughed. A light, smoothing over laugh. Then she touched our mother's arm and said, "Mum, don't take it personally, okay? He's joking." My mother said, "Of course, honey." It was not of course at all, and everyone standing within earshot knew it. And she said it anyway because that's what she does. She absorbs whatever she has to absorb to protect people she loves from having a difficult night. My father set his plate down on the counter very gently. He looked at the quartz surface, at his own hands on the edge of it, and he folded them. Those big, cracked hands that had spent 37 winters in the cold, that had worked on other people's cars for free because he said you don't charge family, and said it about people who weren't family at all. And he was quiet in the way he gets when he's made a decision rather than lost his words. I was half a second from saying something right then, and I stopped myself because I knew exactly what would happen if I did. Whatever I said would become the story. The difficult sister-in-law, the one who couldn't let Kira have a single good day. I needed him to keep talking. I needed the room to accumulate enough of the truth before I said any of mine. I watched and I listened. He told a man near the window he was restructuring a major client portfolio. He told someone else he'd had lunch on Bay Street the previous week. He called the BMW in the driveway, which Kira had mentioned to me 2 months ago, that she was covering the payment on because they'd combined things, his firm vehicle. He was building a house of cards out of language, and he'd been doing it so long he'd stopped noticing the draft. I found Kira alone near the dining room for a moment. She grabbed my hand. "He's been rebuilding his client roster," she told me, practically whispering with how proud she was. "January is going to be a turning point. New book of business, everything finally coming together." She was glowing. She was describing a future that had already told Paxton no, and hadn't told her yet. I opened my mouth to warn her gently, right there. And then she placed my hand flat against her side, beneath her ribs, and looked at me the way that means only one thing. 12 weeks, she whispered. "We haven't told anyone. The expenses have been a lot with the house, but once things settle with Paxton's new clients, it's all going to work out." I looked at my little sister's face and understood that I had run out of time for gentle. I still gave him his one chance. I found him near the back door, drink in hand, comfortable in his own home. "How's Vantage treating you these days?" I kept it as neutral as I could make it. It was a door. All he had to do was walk through it. He could have said, "Tegan, I need to tell you something." I would have helped him find a way to make it right before any of this had to happen. Quietly, that same night, before it became what it became. "Vantage is good," he said and smiled. "Really coming together. Good time to be in wealth management." He swirled his glass and leaned in, warming to the subject, and told me about the new client tier he was building, the accounts he was targeting, a number he described as the floor for what the next 12 months would look like. He looked me right in the eye. The father of the baby my sister had just told me about. And he invented every word of it without a single crack. The door closed. 10 minutes later, he made his way back through the kitchen and paused near my father again. "Careful on the counters, Wayne." "Sorry, Gerald," he said to a guest standing nearby, his voice easy and amused. Gerald's a trades guy, so surfaces like this are probably new territory. A couple of people produced uncertain smiles. The woman behind me set down her glass. My father looked at the counter. He'd spent a career installing the infrastructure that runs through walls and ceilings of every building in this city. He knew more about how this house was actually put together than anyone in it. He said nothing. He went to find their coats. He came back with my mother's jacket folded over his arm. "We'll head out," he said quietly. "She's had a lovely night. We don't want to be underfoot." He was still protecting Kira's party. After everything, he was worried about her party. That was the moment I decided. Not just that I was going to say something, but that he was not going to walk my parents out that door and then turn around and toast his future with my mother's butter tart tin, hidden behind a bottle of Chardonnay. I did the math one final time. $22,000 from my parents' savings account. The mortgage in Kira's name alone. The car payment she was covering. A baby coming. A man without income since November. A compliance termination sitting in a public database that anyone could read. This was not a rough patch. This was a person spending my family's future on a performance of himself, and making my parents feel less than, so the performance could feel like more. Paxton tapped his glass with a knife. "Everyone," he called out warmly, and the room turned toward him the way rooms do. He let it settle for a moment. He looked around at all of it, his guests, his kitchen, his island, with the expression of a man surveying everything he'd earned. "To this house," he said. "To new beginnings. And to everyone here who matters." He didn't look at my parents once. Not one single time. My mother was standing 8 feet from him, and he toasted the room without letting his eyes so much as pass over her face. I set my drink down on the quartz counter. My hands were completely still. "Before we toast," I said, clearly enough to carry across the room, "I need to ask about your registration, Paxton." 40 people went quiet at the exact same moment. Paxton laughed, short, dismissive, recruiting the room with his eyes. "Tegan, come on, this really isn't the time." He lifted his brow at the guests nearest him, a small shared gesture of patience. "You've been talking about Vantage all evening," I said, keeping my voice level. Level is louder than raised in a silent room. "When did you last hold an active registration there?" The ease drained out of his face. "I work in financial services compliance," I said. "CIRA registration records are publicly searchable. Your license at Vantage was terminated last November. Compliance-related termination. There's no active registration under your name at any firm in Canada. There hasn't been since the fall." I wasn't reading from anything. I didn't need to. I was simply saying a true thing out loud in a room full of people who had been far too polite to say it, and the weight of it landing in open air was its own evidence. He said my name, once, low and careful. I kept going. "The new book of business, the client roster, the accounts you've been describing all evening. There's nothing to attach them to, Paxton." Kira's face had gone pale across the room. "Paxton," she said, and her voice climbed on his name. "Tell them that's not true." He turned to her, and then he opened his mouth and nothing came out. I watched him search for the sentence, the one he always had ready for every room, every occasion. I watched him not find it. My sister stood in the middle of her beautiful kitchen and waited for the man she loved to deny it, and the silence where his denial should have been was the loudest thing said all evening. The room rearranged in small, quiet ways. A couple near the window reached for their coats. Someone set a glass down very deliberately on a side table. I let it sit. I didn't rush it. Then I turned away from him, because the person who mattered now was not Paxton. "He hasn't worked since last November, Kira," I said, and my voice dropped. "The house, the car, tonight, where do you think it's all been coming from?" Her eyes moved to our parents. And my mother, who had said, of course, and don't worry, and it's fine all evening so the party could go on, walked to the back of the counter, reached behind the wine bottles, and picked up her tin. She carried it the full length of that kitchen and set it down in the center of the quartz island, the dented corner, the faded Father Christmas. Right in the middle of everything Paxton had spent the night showing off. "We brought what we had," she said, not to anyone in particular. To the room, to everyone, the way she always does. Paxton came apart then, not quietly. The polish came off all at once, and what was underneath it was smaller and more ragged than anyone had expected. He pointed at my parents, at their clothes, at where they'd come from, at what a man like him was owed, and he caught himself mid-sentence. but the shape of it was already loose in the room. Every person in that kitchen had heard the outline. Nobody moved toward him, not one. Kira asked him one question: "Where's the baby money?" They had set aside $9,000 together in a joint account. She'd been adding to it for 3 months. When she checked her phone right there, $2,000 remained. He had spent the rest keeping the show on the road. The party, the catering, the lease on the car, the whole glossy version of himself the room was supposed to believe in. She told him to go. 2 words, and Paxton, who had always had one more sentence queued up and ready, finally ran completely out of them. My parents didn't say anything more. My father crossed the room and put his hands on Kira's shoulders, those big scarred hands, and said the thing I will carry with me for the rest of my life. "A house is just a structure, sweetheart. The people who show up for you. That's what makes it something." My mother put both arms around her, and my sister, who had spent years looking past where she came from, stood in the wreckage of her perfect party and let our mother hold her while she cried. The butter tart tin sat on the quartz island with its dented corner and its lid that never quite sealed right, and it was the only honest object in the entire room. The party left the way people leave the scene of something they weren't supposed to witness. Quickly, quietly, without meeting each other's eyes on the way to the door. A few guests touched my mother's shoulder as they passed. One man shook my father's hand at the door and said it was very good to meet him, Gerald, and he did it with a deliberateness that meant something. Kira turned on me when the last guest had gone. Her face was streaked and her voice was hard. "In front of everyone I know," she said. "You did it in front of everyone. I didn't defend myself. I just said the true thing the way I had all night. I tried to tell you 3 weeks ago. You told me to stay out of it." I watched her remember the exact phone call, the exact words, "Stay out of it." And she understood all at once that the staying out of it was most of the reason she was standing here. She barely spoke to me for the first few weeks after. Some of her friends decided I was the villain, the sister who couldn't let her have one good day. I heard secondhand that someone used the word cruel. There were nights I lay awake asking myself whether I had been right or just righteous. They are not the same thing. Anyone who has ever had to say the true thing in a room where no one wanted to hear it knows that being right doesn't mean you get to feel good about it afterward. It just means you can look at yourself. Kira decided not to keep the house. She could carry the mortgage on her own income, barely, with the baby coming and the savings depleted, but she said she didn't want a kitchen that would remind her of that night every single morning. A few weeks later, a for sale sign went up in the yard. The quartz island would belong to a stranger who'd never know its story. My mother's tin came home the very next morning, washed and dried and back on its shelf, as though nothing at all had happened. Kira tried to pay our parents back. She sat at their kitchen table with a notebook and a real plan, monthly amounts, a timeline, interest calculated. My mother put her hand flat over the notebook. "You don't owe us money," she said. "You never did." Because the money had never been the point. It was never going to be what they were hoping to get back. It cost me something too. And I want to be honest about that, because the version of this story where I'm simply the one with the right information leaves something important out. The weeks my sister went quiet were real. The friends of hers who wrote me off were real. Doing the right thing and feeling settled about it are 2 entirely different experiences, and anyone who tells you otherwise has never had to do the hard one. A few Sundays later, I came to my parents' house and found Kira in the kitchen with my mother. She had an apron on. The butter tart tin was on the counter. My mother was trying to teach her the recipe, the one that's never been written down anywhere because it lives in her hands. Kira kept getting the sugar-to-butter ratio wrong and laughing at herself. My mother kept saying, "No, no," like this, guiding her fingers the way she always does, patient as anything. I stood in the doorway and didn't say a word because I didn't want to break it. My sister, who had spent her whole life looking past where she came from, was standing in our mother's kitchen, learning to make the most ordinary thing in the world. And she was happier than I had seen her in that granite house, on its very best day. When the tarts came out, she carried the tin to the table with both hands, careful and a little proud, the exact way my mother always does. And something in my chest that had been locked since the night of the party finally let go. Later, drying dishes at the sink, my father said the thing that put it all to rest inside me. He was working the cloth over a plate slowly, not really talking to anyone. "Cheap isn't a postal code," he said. "Cheap is a man who lets other people pay for his life and then calls them small for it." And I understood that the cheapest thing in that house had been standing behind the quartz island the whole evening. Not for one single second had it been my parents. Kira is due in November. She's moved into a small apartment 10 minutes from Mum and Dad. Plain carpet and good afternoon light, and a landlord who actually answers his phone. My father has been sanding down a used crib he found someone throwing away, working on it in the garage, under the work light in the evenings, humming. My mother's butter tart recipe is written down for the first time in its existence, on a recipe card in Kira's handwriting, tucked inside the tin where it belongs. For the first time in her adult life, my sister has a home that isn't pretending to be something it isn't. I still think about that toast sometimes. "To everyone here who matters," Paxton said, over a house he hadn't paid for, raising a glass he couldn't afford, in front of the two people whose savings had made the whole night possible, and he didn't look at them once. You can learn almost everything you need to know about a person from how they treat the people who have nothing to offer them. My parents brought butter tarts in a dented tin because that's what love looks like, when it has nothing to prove and isn't trying to prove anything at all. That tin is back on its shelf. It's not going anywhere.